Napoleon brought 680,000 soldiers into Russia. Fewer than 100,000 came back. Hitler sent over 3 million troops. It became the deadliest military campaign in human history. Both men were military geniuses. Both had already conquered most of Europe. Both were absolutely certain they would win. And both were destroyed by the same country. So the question isn't why they invaded Russia. The question is, what is it about Russia that keeps breaking every army that enters it? Russia has never been the wealthiest country in Europe. It has never had the most advanced technology. For most of its history, it wasn't even the most powerful military force on the continent. And yet, no foreign power has successfully conquered and held Russia, not once, in over 1,000 years. That is not luck. That is a pattern, and patterns have explanations. To understand this one, we need to look at 4 things that have protected Russia for centuries and still protect it today: geography, climate, logistics, and something harder to measure, but just as real: a willingness to endure suffering that has broken the spirit of every invading army that has ever tested it. Russia is the largest country on Earth. Not slightly larger, enormously larger. Russia covers 17.1 million square kilometers, more than the entire continent of South America. It spans 11 time zones. It contains every type of terrain imaginable: dense forest, open steppe, frozen tundra, mountain ranges, and thousands of rivers. For an invading army, this creates one problem that has no clean solution. You can win at the border. You can win in the first month. You can capture cities, destroy armies, and advance hundreds of miles into Russian territory, and you will still be nowhere near finished. Because Russia simply has more space than any army in history has been able to fill, supply, and hold at the same time. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed into Russia with the Grande Armée, the largest invasion force ever assembled in European history up to that point. 680,000 soldiers, the finest cavalry in the world, artillery that had shattered every European army it had ever faced. Napoleon had won over 50 major battles. He had never lost a war. His plan for Russia was straightforward: force a decisive battle near the border, crush the Russian army in a single engagement, and dictate terms from a position of total dominance. It was the same strategy that had worked everywhere else. Russia had a different plan entirely. The Russian military commander Barclay de Tolly made a decision that seemed like cowardice, but was actually genius. He ordered a full retreat. Not a tactical withdrawal, a complete, systematic retreat, deeper and deeper into Russian territory. And as they retreated, Russian forces destroyed everything behind them. Crops were burned, livestock was killed, bridges were demolished, villages were torched, grain stores were destroyed before the French could reach them. Napoleon's army was advancing, but advancing into nothing. No food, no shelter, no supplies. Every mile they gained, their supply lines stretched longer and thinner across hostile, empty territory. Napoleon had expected to feed his army off the Russian land. The Russians had taken that option away. Napoleon finally got his decisive battle at Borodino, one of the bloodiest single days of combat in the Napoleonic Wars. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded in one day. Napoleon won. The road to Moscow was open. He entered Moscow on September 14, 1812, expecting the Russian Tsar to surrender. Instead, Moscow burned. Russian authorities had ordered the city torched rather than let it serve as a comfortable winter headquarters for the French army. Napoleon sat in a burning city, waiting for a peace offer that never came. After 35 days, with winter approaching and his army starving, he ordered the retreat. What followed was catastrophic. Of the 680,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. Here is something that gets misunderstood about Russia's military history. The winter didn't defeat Napoleon alone. When the French retreat began in October 1812, temperatures were cold, but not yet at their worst. The real killer was starvation, exhaustion, and Cossack cavalry that harassed the retreating columns relentlessly, day and night. The winter accelerated a collapse that was already underway, caused by the scorched earth strategy, the overstretched supply lines, and the refusal of Russia to accept defeat. This matters because it reveals something important. Russia's greatest weapon is not the cold. It's the combination of space, denial of resources, and an absolute refusal to stop fighting that turns every invasion into a war of attrition. And wars of attrition, Russia almost always wins. On June 22, 1941, exactly 129 years after Napoleon crossed into Russia, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German and Axis troops crossed the Soviet border simultaneously. It was the largest land invasion in human history. Hitler's reasoning was identical to Napoleon's: strike fast, destroy the Soviet army near the border before it can retreat, capture Moscow, and force a surrender within weeks. German military planners estimated the campaign would last between 3 and 5 months. They even had a code name for the plan to administer the conquered Soviet territory before winter arrived. They had studied Napoleon's campaign. They believed they had learned from his mistakes. They had not. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, German forces achieved stunning victories. They destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many on the ground before they could take off. They encircled and captured entire Soviet armies. By October 1941, German forces could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars. But something extraordinary was happening behind the front lines. The Soviet Union was dismantling its entire industrial base and moving it east, beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach. Over 1,500 factories were loaded onto trains and relocated to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia. While German forces were advancing in the west, Soviet factories were being reassembled thousands of miles away, and within months were producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at a rate that stunned German military intelligence. The battle that defined the entire Eastern Front was Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943. German forces fought their way into the city block by block, floor by floor, room by room. Soviet defenders refused to yield. Famously, Soviet commander Vasily Chukoev ordered his troops to stay so close to the German lines that German air power and artillery couldn't be used without killing their own soldiers. After 5 months of the most brutal urban combat in history, Soviet forces encircled the entire German 6th Army, 300,000 men. On February 2, 1943, the survivors surrendered. It was the moment the war turned. Germany had lost its best army, and Russia had demonstrated something the world already should have known. It will not stop, ever. Military historians often say that amateurs study tactics, but professionals study logistics. Russia is the ultimate proof of that principle. A modern army consumes enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts every single day. Getting those supplies to the front requires roads, railways, and vehicles, all of which must function across whatever terrain and weather Russia provides. In summer, Russian roads that aren't paved turn into muddy rivers that swallow trucks whole. In winter, those same roads freeze, but vehicles break down in temperatures of -30 or 40 Celsius. Russia's railway gauge is deliberately different from the rest of Europe, meaning supply trains from the west have to stop and be reloaded at the border. Every one of these factors adds friction, and in a war that extends across thousands of kilometers over years, friction kills armies. There is a military concept called strategic depth, the ability to absorb an invasion by retreating into your own territory while maintaining the capacity to keep fighting. Most countries have very little of it. France, once German forces crossed the border in 1940, fell in 6 weeks. Poland lasted less than a month. Russia has more strategic depth than any nation on Earth. Even if an invading army captures the border regions, captures major cities, destroys entire army groups, Russia can keep retreating. And every mile of retreat makes the invader weaker, while Russia rebuilds further east. Napoleon retreated from Moscow over 1,500 kilometers back to the Russian border. Germany was pushed back over 2,000 kilometers from Stalingrad to Berlin. The further into Russia you go, the harder it becomes to stay alive. Numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people in World War II. That is more than every other country in the war combined on both sides. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Entire generations were wiped out. And yet, the Soviet Union kept fighting. This willingness to absorb catastrophic losses and continue is not something that can be explained purely by geography or logistics. It comes from something deeper, a historical memory of existential threats that goes back to the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, which killed an estimated half of the Russian population at the time. Russia has been invaded, destroyed, and rebuilt so many times that survival under impossible conditions has become part of its national identity. Invaders consistently underestimated this, and that underestimation consistently destroyed them. The specific factors that have protected Russia for centuries have not disappeared in the modern era. The territory is still enormous, the climate is still brutal, the logistics challenges are still real. But there is now an additional layer that makes direct invasion of Russia essentially unthinkable. Russia possesses approximately 5,580 nuclear warheads, the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth, according to the Federation of American Scientists. Any conventional military conflict that threatened the existence of the Russian state would carry the risk of nuclear escalation, a risk that no military planner in the world is willing to ignore. This doesn't make Russia invincible. It means the cost of attempting to conquer it has become, in the most literal sense possible, potentially civilization-ending. So if armies can't defeat Russia, and nuclear weapons make direct invasion unthinkable, the world tried something different. In February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies launched what they called the most sweeping economic sanctions ever imposed on a major economy. Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT, the global financial messaging system that connects virtually every bank on Earth. The Russian central bank's $630 billion in foreign reserves were frozen overnight. Hundreds of Western companies, from McDonald's to Shell to Apple, announced they were leaving Russia. Western governments were confident. Cut Russia off from the global economy, and the war machine would grind to a halt. That is not what happened. Here is what the architects of those sanctions had not fully accounted for. Russia had been preparing for exactly this since 2014, when Western sanctions first arrived after the annexation of Crimea. For 8 years, Russia quietly built a parallel financial system. It stockpiled gold reserves. It reduced its dependence on the US dollar. It built domestic alternatives to Western payment systems. And when the sanctions hit in 2022, Russia had a lifeline that no sanction could touch: China and India. China became Russia's largest trading partner, absorbing Russian oil, gas, and commodities at discounted prices, and selling Russia the electronics, machinery, and components it could no longer buy from the West. India's oil imports from Russia increased by over 1,300% in the year after the invasion, according to the International Energy Agency. The West had closed the front door, but the back door, running through Beijing and Delhi, was wide open. In March 2022, the Russian ruble collapsed, losing nearly half its value within weeks. Western economists predicted the Russian economy would shrink by 15%. Some predicted collapse. Then something unexpected happened. The ruble recovered completely.
By mid-2022, it had returned to pre-war levels and at one point became the world's best-performing currency that year. How? Russia mandated that buyers of its oil and gas, the lifeblood of its economy, pay in rubles, not dollars. Energy-hungry countries in Europe, Asia, and beyond had no choice but to comply or freeze. The Russian economy shrank by just 2.1% in 2022, according to the IMF, far less than almost anyone had predicted. By 2023, it had grown again. Russia's defense industry was running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Military production had tripled. The economic war, like the military campaigns of Napoleon and Hitler before it, had underestimated the same thing: Russia's capacity to endure and adapt.
Here is what Napoleon, Hitler, Western economists, and every other force that has tried to break Russia have all shared in common. They all believed their approach was different. They all believed they had found the strategy that would finally work. Napoleon had the greatest army ever assembled. Hitler had the most advanced war machine of his era. The West had the most powerful economic system in human history. All of them looked at Russia and saw a problem they could solve with enough force, enough resources, enough confidence. And all of them encountered the same answer. It is not just geography that protects Russia. It is not just the winter. It is not just nuclear weapons or oil revenues. It is the fact that Russia has been fighting for its survival, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. And every time the world has declared it finished, isolated, broken, Russia found a way to still be there. The story of Russia is not a story of invincibility. Napoleon got in. Hitler got in. Sanctions cut Russia off from the global financial system. None of it was enough. Because defeating Russia, truly defeating it, has never been just a military problem or an economic problem. It is a civilizational problem. You are not fighting an army. You are not fighting a government. You are fighting 1,000 years of survival instinct, built into a country so vast that it has absorbed every catastrophe the world has thrown at it, and emerged, damaged but unbroken, every single time. If this video changed the way you see Russia, not as a headline, but as a civilization with its own deep logic, tell us in the comments. Do you think the sanctions will eventually work? Or is this just the latest chapter in a story that always ends the same way? Subscribe and hit the bell. Because the next story is just as complex, and the lessons it holds are just as important to understand right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.